everyone for coming. Wow, I had to actually make more copies of the handout, so that's great. Thanks, Philosophy Association, Philosophy Department, the Honors Student Council. I'm happy to bring in our honored guest from Salem State University. Not really the better half, but my other...
Smarter half.
My other half, who is also a professor of philosophy. And our talk today is entitled, Who is the Happy Person? And how we wanted to go about this topic was not to really talk about those uncontroversial cases of happy people who are obviously happy, like me, but more those borderline cases where it's not clear to us whether or not we should say that person is happy. And so what we've done is we've given you a handout with 4 different cases that each one was selected because there seem to be different intuitions that pull us in these cases. So what we're going to do is each of us, for the purposes at least of the presentation, is going to take a side on whether or not the person is happy and why or why not. And as we go through, on the right, you see it says happy or not happy. After you listen to us sort of debate or at least discuss the ways we might think them as happy or not happy, maybe you could also go along and check on your own whether you think the person is happy or not happy. Then what we're going to do when we're done with the 4 cases, we're going to give you a second handout that shows what some of the main contemporary views in the philosophy of happiness are and how they would judge these cases. So that maybe you can learn a little bit more about your view of happiness, or maybe sort of challenge some of your initial intuitions that you had and revise them in light of what maybe your preferred theory was saying. So before we get to the cases though, when we ask who is the happy person, we might just mean, is that person happy now? Or we might be asking, does that person live a happy life? And when we ask about whether a person is living a happy life, we might think of it one of 2 ways. One might be your life is a collection of experiences, so as long as you have more happy experiences than not, your life is happy. On the other hand, we might think of a life as more than just a sum of its parts, as sort of a holistic kind of property, such that it might require our own kind of special judgment about whether or not the life is a happy life.
Yeah, and thank you guys for having me again too. I'm going to say something now, right? And there's another sort of preliminary distinction we might worry about when we're thinking about happiness, and that is this, right? Sometimes when we use this word happy, we seem to be using it in a sort of purely descriptive sense, right? To sort of describe someone as being in some particular psychological state without necessarily attaching any sort of value to that state. Right? This seems to be the way, for example, that contemporary psychologists and many economists seem to use the word happiness in their studies. Whereas philosophers tend to use happiness sometimes in another sense, more like an evaluation of someone's life, right? So when we judge someone to be happy from this point of view, we might be saying that, well, their life seems to be going well in certain respects. We're sort of placing a certain value or measure on whether or not their life is working out the way it should.
Okay, so let's look at that first case study, which is on your handout. I'll read along with you. Hugh. Hugh is generally very cheerful, highly satisfied with his life, and feels deeply fulfilled. He enjoys his life greatly and has a very pleasant experience on the whole. But he does not realize that his wife, children, and friends cannot stand him, ridiculing him behind his back. They pretend to love him only because he is wealthy. If he knew these things, he would be devastated. But he remains ignorant of the facts, even into old age, and feels completely satisfied through the end of his life. He never learns the truth. Is Hugh happy? Well, it seems like this brings one of the first issues at stake with regard to happiness, what matters to happiness. Is it enough that Hugh's life by him is perceived to be going well, or must his desires actually be satisfied? I think you could defend the idea that Hugh is happy for the reason that he simply perceives himself to be so. I mean, if he sat down, even in a particularly reflective mood, and thought about the way things are going, he would probably judge that things are pretty darn good. we know that his perceptions are mistaken, and that what he desires, which is an actual loving spouse and family and friends, isn't being met. But that's irrelevant to his happiness, because epistemically there would be no way for Hugh to tell the difference. And by that I mean the evidence Hugh has doesn't point him towards the truth, or that there's any suspicion that things are other than the way he takes them to be. So if we think of happiness as a way of experiencing your life, in that sense, Hugh's happy.
On the other hand, though, right, I just have this worry, right? Can someone actually be happy with their life when they're so radically deceived about the way it's actually going, right? Can you really be happy when your most centrally held and most important desires are not actually going fulfilled? He thinks they are, but they're not actually being met. Hugh then has certain desires that he takes to be really important to him, namely that he's got a loving spouse, he's got adoring children, and these desires that Hugh has are going unmet, unsatisfied. So, at least from one perspective, my perspective, I might be willing to say, look, Hugh isn't happy, because in order to be happy, it's not enough that I just think that my desires are satisfied. They actually have to be so, right, in order for my life to be happy.
Okay, well, so suppose I'm compelled by that, which I'm not saying I am, but just assuming that, I was concerned about that. And, I'm like, oh, Hugh, poor guy. I kind of feel bad for him. Maybe I should tell him. But then I think to myself, well, wait a minute. I know people don't always want to know the truth. So maybe Hugh's like that. So say I ask Hugh, I say, hey, Hugh, say you could choose two kinds of lives. One life is a life of experience and belief where things seem to be going well, you think your desires are being met, and you could go on believing that way indefinitely, even though they're not. Would you choose that kind of life? Or would you choose a life of truth and where you would always know the truth of the case no matter what? Seems to me an empirical question how Hugh would respond. Maybe Hugh could say, I value experience more than I value truth. In that case, it seems to me that Hugh's desires are actually being met. So, you really have to ask Hugh. Or what about the opposite case? What about a case of someone who has all their desires being met but doesn't perceive them to be that way? So here I have in mind something like a perfectionist, someone who wants to be a really great philosopher, to be well respected and admired by others. And they really are well respected and admired. But because they're a perfectionist, they're just miserable. They think they're a failure. There's a situation in which someone's desires are met. They don't seem to me to be happy. So what would you say in that case?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's not enough just that my desires are actually met too, right? I might be willing to admit or cede a little bit to your side that it's also important that the person think that things are going well as well, right? So maybe I think there's really sort of two components that sort of attach to a happy life, right? On the one hand, you got to believe that things are going pretty darn well for you, and they also actually have to be going pretty darn well for you, right? But I actually don't think that this is really the sort of full story yet, right? I think there's actually all sorts of other sorts of conditions we might want to put on a person's choice of values or how they go about evaluating their life. And so maybe we need to actually turn to a second case here to see what this might tell us. So let's read about case 2 here. This is Jill, right? So Jill is a woman who has lived her entire life at the family compound. She was born a member of the cult and has never known what life is like outside of the family. She has some children with the cult leader, as do most of the women, but he is cold, demanding, and rather derisive towards her. Jill's days are hard as they are full of manual labor and toilsome work. Like all members, Jill must endure painful weekly cleansing rituals. She has only the most rudimentary education, and no one has ever left the compound, so Jill doesn't realize that women in other communities have other interesting opportunities. When Jill reflects on her situation, she doesn't see anything wrong. She thinks this is just the way things are supposed to be, and she is fully satisfied with her life. She lived this way her whole life, but is she happy? Now, if you think about this from one perspective, right, Jill's life doesn't have much pleasure in it or much enjoyment as it's described, right? Nonetheless, she does judge her life to be satisfactory, right? So at least on one view of happiness, where you have to have a bunch of positive affect, right, or good feeling sorts of emotions, it seems clear that Jill's going to fail be happy. But I think that she's unhappy for different reasons, right? It's not just that her life doesn't feel good from the inside. Instead, I think that we should question whether or not we should trust Jill's judgment that she's satisfied with her life. Right? I mean, is this a reliable sort of report? After all, it seems quite clear that people suffer from all sorts of epistemic blind spots when it comes to introspecting about whether or not they're actually satisfied with the way their life is going. There are all sorts of contemporary empirical studies that seem to indicate that we make systematic mistakes when it comes to reporting from a first-person perspective how our life is going. So, for example, right, there are these famous experiments that show if you find a dime on a copy machine right before I ask you how well your life is going, you'll rate your entire life as having been better, right? Or if I happen to call you on a sunny day instead of a rainy day, the same sort of thing. You'll say your entire life has been really awesome as a result. And it seems to me that these sort of trivial aspects of context shouldn't have that sort of impact on the momentum of your entire life. Right? So I wonder whether or not we should even trust these first-person reports that Jill's giving us.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a sense in which you're right. There are certain arbitrary influences that can influence our judgments of happiness. It seems, for example, that finding a dime, for example, shouldn't actually have an effect on whether your life overall is going well. But the thing about those surveys is that there's reason to think that those are just poorly designed surveys, that we could change the questions to make your first-person judgments of your life satisfaction more reliable. So, for example, surveys that first ask you to contemplate the various domains in your life or your important values in life and then rank them. If you ask those sorts of questions preceding the judgment of one's life satisfaction, you're more likely to get a reliable report in that case. So it's not necessarily that we shouldn't trust first-person judgments. And in any case, I don't really think that's what's going on here, because the way the example is written seems to me that it's not like Jill's judgment vacillates. She seems to judge her life as satisfied on the whole throughout her whole life. So again, I think that if we think of happiness as a way of experiencing your life, who else but Jill to ask? I mean, isn't she going to be the best authority over whether she is experiencing happiness? I mean, we might have some concerns about the ways her judgment might differ, but if we have any hope at all, it seems like we should ask Jill.
All right, well, let's put aside then this question of reliability, right? Because I think there's actually another, perhaps even more important reason why Jill's judgment that she's satisfied with her life is not sufficient for her happiness, and namely that's this. She just doesn't have enough information to make an informed choice about whether or not her life is going well. I mean, don't you think that if Jill sort of went out into the world and gathered more information about a variety of different forms of life, don't you think she'd choose against the cult life, right? She'd try to take some different sort of life for herself. So it seems to me that if we put Jill in some sort of idealized position of full information, there's no way she would decide to stay in the cult. And what this sort of indicates to me then is that maybe the desires that Jill currently has, that she's using to evaluate her life, maybe she'd change them if she was more fully informed, right? And so choose against, right, this sort of life. She might even decide that now her current life is completely unsatisfactory.
Right, but again, who's to say if Jill were more informed, she wouldn't choose the exact same thing? I mean, it is possible that she could choose to continue to stay in the cult. I mean, maybe she says, you know what, I don't value things like worldly travel or career or all of these friends. I like where I'm at. I want to stay in the cult. Isn't that possible?
I mean, that's possible, right? But either way, it seems to me information is going to make her better off. Right? Either on the one hand, she gets more information, and so now she's more emboldened in her conviction to remain, or she's more assured that this is the right sort of life for herself, or she gets more information and realizes, yeah, this stinks, right? So maybe I should take some active steps towards making changes that will get me a life that actually better suits who I am, right? Makes me happier.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that more information can embolden you. I mean, it's always helpful to get more information to help strengthen and solidify your beliefs, but more information is not always a good thing. I mean, for one, more information could create a state of envy, right? I want to keep, like the keeping up with the Joneses kind of idea. But also, some studies have shown that, in fact, too much much choice or having choice impedes your happiness. So here I have in mind some work done by Daniel Gilbert, a psychologist at Harvard, who gave subjects in one group an object as a gift without any choice of returning it, and in another group gave the subjects a gift but said that they had 3 days to swap it out for a different one. And for those that had the choice to swap it out, even if they didn't swap it out, they reported as being less happy with their gift because of the fact that they could have chosen otherwise. So in that sense, more information doesn't always mean a good thing. Second, what if Jill gets this extra information but she can't leave her community? Right? What good does it have? What good is it to have this information and want to change your values if you're in a society that won't permit that? In that sense, more information is actually going to harm Jill.
But yeah, of course, right? I mean, if you're in a community that doesn't allow you to leave, then of course you're not going to be living a happy life, right? Because there's no way you could have chosen this life autonomously for yourself. And again, it seems to me that sort of autonomously choosing my life is central to this idea of happiness. You kind of have to live in a society that at least allows you to critically reflect on your values, maybe change them if necessary. And it seems to me that if she were more informed, right, then her values would probably change, or even if they didn't, at least they'd be more autonomous, right? They'd be more reflective of her will.
Right? To me, it's not clear that Jill is autonomous. I mean, she does have some preferences, which suggests there's some choice. But I also want to push you on what you mean by autonomy. I mean, it sounded like you said it was the ability to completely revise our preferences and beliefs, but how many of us actually need that, right? I mean, I think that a lot of people don't always sort of choose their values. I can think of a lot of cases of this, but one I have in mind is people in arranged marriages. There are a lot of people in arranged marriages who actually report being incredibly happy in those marriages. So it seems like maybe your sort of restriction of autonomy might be too restrictive.
Yeah, but I think one of the reasons to value autonomy in happiness is because it's important to ensure that Jill's preferences and values are somehow authentic, right? That they actually genuinely reflect the kind of person that she is. And it seems to me, at least as the story goes, where she's living in the culture, the values she has that lead her to say she's satisfied are inauthentic to her. They're not really the values or preferences that reflect her. They're not her identity sort of showing through, right? Instead, though, Jill's values should, if she's going to be happy, fit with her emotional and her sort of biological nature as a human being and reflect her identity. If she were able to leave, go out into the world, gather more information again about other societies, only then would her values sort of genuinely reflect and express her identity and therefore be authentic. So it seems to me that Jill's life just isn't going well for her because she's living inauthentically.
Well, what if Jill does leave? I mean, it's still possible she would choose to come back. Is that, in that sense, would her values be authentic? Also, I mean, what does it really mean to say a value as authentic? You suggest a value is authentic if it has some kind of fit with my emotional and biological nature. But what if you think sort of existence precedes essence in a certain sense? That it doesn't make any sense to talk about first I have this nature and then I choose values that are reflective of it. Maybe the values I have themselves sort of define my nature. So in that sense, perhaps Jill's values are authentic for the reason that even though they were given to her from birth, she has internalized them and they are reflective of who she is. I'm starting to suspect that you don't really just mean authenticity and autonomy, that you're really building more into the picture here. It's not just gathering information, but now you seem to be making the stronger claim that anyone who lives in a cult just can't be happy. Anyone who's living in a cult just can't have authentic values. And so you're suggesting then that having more information is necessarily going to point you towards some directions and away from others. And that seems to me like you're saying that there are objective values that ought to be placed on a life, that there are only certain kinds of life that are appropriately called the happy life.
Yeah, I guess I might agree with that, right? I think there are objective values that you need, or basic things that you need in order to be a happy human being, right? In addition to autonomy and living a life authentically, it also seems clear to me that you need health in order to be happy. You might need some measure of access to material resources in order to act on your desires. It seems important that we can engage in intimate and loving relationships with other human beings, right? And also security. You might need a security in your life in order to be happy. And it seems to me that Jill's life just lacks a lot of these centrally important things. And so I wonder, can a person really be happy when their life is going so objectively poorly for them? But, I mean, just to push the point even further, right? I don't even think that list that I just gave is exhaustive of the objective values that a person needs in order to live a happy life. In fact, I think there's one more really centrally important one, and that is moral virtue, right? So let's look at case 3 to see if we can test this intuition. Right, so here's case 3. This is Judah. Judah is a happily married man and a highly respected physician, but he has made the mistake of embarking on an affair. When he tries to break off this relationship, the woman threatens to expose his adultery. All he has worked for his entire life is at risk, since if the affair is revealed, his wife will divorce him, his children will reject him, and the members of his community will no longer support his medical practice. So, Judah arranges for his brother to have his mistress murdered without any danger of the crime being traced back to him. The police attribute the death to a drifter, and the case is closed. Judah's life goes on as normal without any further complications. He appears to feel no guilt. Is Judah happy? So the first point that this sort of brings to mind to me is that, look, just as a mere practical matter, could a person be happy when they're living a life that is so out of step with the social, legal, and moral norms of their society? I think not, right? I think Judah can't be happy because when you violate the legal and the social norms of your society, you're no longer capable of genuinely and honestly relating to other human beings, right? You always have to lie about who you are. You always have to worry about being caught, so you're always constantly covering up your true nature. And because of this, you sort of lack any ability to relate to other human beings in an open and honest way. So that seems to suggest to me that Judah's got to be suffering from some form of a psychic dissonance, or maybe he's feeling some inner guilt for this sort of behavior. There's got to be some psychological ramifications for sort of behaving out of step with your social and legal norms of your society.
Well, I'm willing to grant that as a general rule, it's probably at least prudent to try and choose choices that are in line with your social norms and moral norms, for the reason that to do otherwise opens yourself up the risk of getting punished, and who likes to get punished, right? But if you can get away with it, then what harm is there to you? How would that necessarily impede your ability to be happy? Also, the example suggests that Judah doesn't actually feel any guilt. So again, how can, just like Hugh and Jill, how can you suffer by things of which you're unaware? Maybe also Judah doesn't value those things. Maybe Judah doesn't care about having to tell the truth or having close relationships with others. Why should we automatically assume that that's something Judah would value?
Well, I guess it's just because he's a human being, right? There are just certain things that are important when it comes to being a human being and living a human life, right? His life is missing key aspects that would make his life go well for him, right? Not only is he incapable of genuinely and openly relating to other human beings, but it seems that because he has to hide himself from everyone else, he's quite obviously living in bad faith. And more than that, he's also probably suffering from some sort of alienation in terms of his life and his projects, right? So there just seems to be all sorts of ways in which his life is lacking really important features of happiness.
Well, I'm not quite sure that you can say he's living in bad faith. I mean, it seems like he has actually considered his values and ranked them and chosen the values of family and success and fame over the value of his mistress's life. Maybe you don't like the way he ranked his values, but it does seem that he's considered them. This case also reminds me of, I love The Matrix, one of the best philosophical movies, and it's got a lot of kung fu, but I'm thinking of Cypher. So here's the situation, sorry for those of you who haven't seen it, I don't know why not, but Cypher is someone who had and chose to go back into the matrix, and in doing so, harmed others to get there. I mean, those seem to be considered values that are reflective of him, but you probably just won't like those values.
Yeah, I suppose that's what I'm saying. I don't like those values. There's an objective set of standard values, right, when it comes to morality. And so it seems to me that Judah's life, Cypher's life, they can't be happy lives because there's at least one critically important thing that their life hasn't got, and that is moral virtue. Right?
Well, wait a minute. It's not obvious to me that someone can't be immoral and happy, first. But second, it's not clear that he doesn't have moral virtue. I mean, you seem to be begging the question against certain views of morality. I mean, there are subjectivist versions of morality. He could be a subjectivist. He could be an egoist. Hey, Judah could even be a utilitarian, right? So maybe Judah's an egoist. Would it matter if he actually thought he was doing the morally right thing? I mean, would that make any difference? So it seems to me that you're saying that he has to have an objective morality. Or maybe Judah's really smart, he's read a lot of philosophy, he's just a moral nihilist. He just rejects morality. It seems that he could value his life according to certain standards without him having to be moral standards.
But it's not enough that he just accept his standards and feel as though he's acting in accord with them, right? Not even his moral standards. I mean, it seems to me, again, that there just are some objective moral standards that apply to the living of a human life that sort of cash out for us what it means to be an excellent human being, right? And one way to test this intuition is to ask ourselves a very simple question. If given the choice, would you trade places with Judah? And it seems clear to me that most people would say, no, I wouldn't. But why? I mean, what does his life lack? It seems to have everything except for one key feature. It's an immoral life. And so when we judge that we wouldn't trade places with him, we seem to be impugning his life in a certain way. We say there's something wrong with it. The only thing that we can really identify as being wrong with it is that he's immoral. So I guess that we might even intuitively think that living morally is required for living the happy life.
Wait a minute, though. I mean, why wouldn't we choose Judah's life? He got away with it, right? I mean, so this brings to mind maybe another sort of important feature about happiness. Maybe we can't actually know whether a life is happy until it's fully lived. I mean, I can tell you, I don't know if I'd want to switch with Judah until I know how his life actually turned out. And now knowing that he got away with it, why not choose to switch places with him? So with that in mind about this idea of seeing how a life plays out, this leads into our last case, Joe Pa. All right, so Joe Paterno, he lived a long life, dying at the age of 85. For 46 years, he was head coach of the Penn State Nittany Lions, and he ended his career with more wins than any college coach in history. More than a football coach, he was a beloved figure in the college community, in part because of the emphasis he placed on moral conduct. He donated more than $4 million to Penn State, funded the school's library that bears his name, and the community erected statues in order to memorialize his greatness. However, 2.5 months before his death, a scandal broke that exposed Paterno's former assistant coach of allegedly engaging in pedophilia and child rape while coaching at Penn State and sometimes using Penn State facilities. Many thought Paterno clearly would have known, and yet he said nothing. So Paterno's otherwise pristine reputation was tarnished. Doing the math, he spent 99.8% of his life in honor, prestige, and praise. But does that last 0.2% ruin his happiness? Was Paterno's life a happy life? Well, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, it matters how we might evaluate a life. Do we want to look at it as an aggregate of moments, or do we want to look at it more as sort of a property of the way the life was lived, or a summary judgment of one's life as a whole? If we look at it just as an aggregate of experiences, it does seem to say that Joe had a happy life. He spent most of his life satisfied. Even if you add into that, like any possible guilt he may have experienced if he did know about it for those 15 years before the case broke out, even if you add that in, the majority of his life was spent pleasant and feeling satisfied. But what about looking at a life in the other way? one way we might think of it is, what kind of judgment would Joe make about his life on his deathbed? Like, what would his deathbed judgment be? And here it's not clear what it would be. I mean, maybe Joe is going to choose to focus on all the good he did, all the players he affected and helped, all the wins he had. He might focus on his family, his children, his grandchildren. He might focus on all of those things and judge his life to be satisfied and happy. On the other hand, though, it's quite possible that Joe himself would judge his life as unsatisfied. He may be upset about how it ended, but even more so, he might start to grapple with the idea that he wasn't the man he took himself to be, or he didn't live the life that he thought he was living. And so he's somehow violated some of his fundamental commitments, and which kind of would then undermine his judgment of his entire life. Maybe he was experiencing great psychological harm, suffering some sort of crisis, because, maybe he was frantically thinking about how he could undo what he had done. I mean, and the fact that he died so quickly after the scandal broke, 2.5 months later, suggests that he was actually kind of a wreck. On the other hand, though, we might not want to rest the whole case on just a deathbed judgment. You've already pointed out the way that our judgments can be defective with life satisfaction, right? It's true that our current moments also influence our judgments of our life. So whether we're hungry or whether we're in a good mood today. So maybe there are too many factors that are influencing Joe's deathbed judgment. We could still, though, such that he's misremembering his past. So maybe we could talk about judgments Joe made throughout his life. So at various points in his life, how did Joe judge his life overall? Because we make those judgments, right? At age 30, I might judge my life as going well, being optimistic for the future. And then at 60, I'm going to judge it's not going so well because I haven't met any of those goals yet. But I think whatever it is, it's up to Joe. It's going to depend on sort of his judgment about his life.
Yeah, I guess that one place to start here is to ask, well, what if Joe did know that this behavior was going on 15 years ago? Would that make a difference? And it seems to me that it might, right? Because just knowing that this was going on in your facilities and you're not saying anything about it seems like it would have a really negative effect on you, right? Either you're going to have to sort of suffer and feel some guilt, or if you don't feel any guilt, this is my moral objectivism coming in again, then you must be suffering some form of denial, right? Which has also got to hamper your ability to be happiness, right? But I guess I'd also like to look at this from a different sort of objective perspective, and that's this. Not only did Joe probably die in shame in his own eyes, but he died in shame in our eyes as well. And this sort of reminds me of Solon's favorite statement, right? That judge no man happy till he's dead, right? I don't think that Paterno had a happy life, but for reasons different than those that Jennifer was worried about. In particular, I think he's unhappy because he didn't live a life of flourishing, right? This notion of flourishing that I'm talking about, I want to sort of separate out all those questions about morality that I was talking about before, and instead, I want to consider just simply questions about whether or not Joe's life sort of meets the standards for a good, natural, right, human life. So here's one way in which I think Joe's life could have been better. He could have flourished more, right? His legacy has been destroyed. It turns out, right, that from now on, anytime we think of Joe Paterno, immediately in our mind, we're also going to think about pedophilia and child rape at Penn State. And so it turns out that Joe's name will forever be associated, his legacy will forever be associated with this scandal. And I don't know about you guys, but from my own perspective and judging for myself, I'd rather die in utter anonymity than have my name be associated with that sort of infamy. I'd rather die sort of unknown. And so it looks like his life could have been better had he not suffered in that way. In fact, here's another way to think about it, right? If Joe Paterno had died 6 months earlier and the scandal never broke, every single one of us would judge his life as like epically valuable, right? And this is like a great example of an excellent human life. But the fact that we learned, right, in those last 2.5 months of what was really going on seems to just destroy all of that value, for me at least. Well, there's another sort of really interesting point that I think, and this is a point that Robert Nozick makes about happiness, right? And that is this. It's not just how much pleasure and enjoyment we get out of life that matters to us. It also matters to us the narrative direction that our life takes. Right? So if I were to give you two choices, a choice between two lives, each of which are equally valuable or equally pleasurable, I think we can decide which one is preferable, right? So imagine the first life starts out great, but then it's all sort of downhill from there until you sort of end in utter misery, right? Life number two starts out kind of poorly, but it's an uphill trajectory all the way until you end, right, in a really good spot. It seems to me that if both lives have the same amount of pleasure in them, we're going to go with the second one. We like the narrative direction that's uphill, right? But Joe's life lacks that. Joe's life started out great, and then in the last 2.5 months came crashing down, right? It went in the wrong direction. We want to go out on a high note. We put a lot of weight on good endings, right? And Joe's life lacks a good ending. So, simply put, right, I think that there are all sorts of ways in which Joe's life could have gone better for him, and so his life lacks some of those central features of excellence that would make it a happy human life.
So, I mean, that's kind of, at this point, that's sort of our survey, initial survey of these cases. So I don't know how many of you actually decided to mark whether they were happy or not. So now we want to give you a handout that talks about some of the main views of happiness and how we think they would determine whether or not these people are happy. Using, of course, smiley faces.
Before you got here, so you put myself on.
Alright, so as it's going around, on one side we have views, a chart, and then just for your own references, if you find that you want to learn more about one of these views, on the other side we have a selected bibliography of places to go read more to learn about these different views of happiness. So just briefly kind of summarizing what this chart says, kind of the high points here, we have it in two sections, and this mirrors the discussion that Mike started in the beginning about two different ways we might think of happiness as a sort of mental state or this sort of evaluative state that's often referred to as well-being. So in terms of a mental state, often they're distinguished in terms of, on one hand we have like felt subjective experience, where that could include any number of the following. It could include pleasures, right? And you could still make a distinction between certain kinds of pleasures as having more weight than others. It could include emotions. It could include moods. It could include being pleased by things. So those who think that some version of pleasure or positive affect is really what's crucial for happiness is going to have that kind of count. And notice that they're going to judge everyone as happy except for Jill. And the only reason why they're judging Jill as not happy is because of all the pain she undergoes in her daily cult life. But again, if it's just felt subjective experience, all of our cases are going to judge them or have positive felt subjective experience. And then in terms of the second sort of category under this happiness as mental state, these are preference satisfaction views. The idea here is that you might think that happiness is not so much felt emotion or pleasure, but more of like a judgment that my life is going well or that my desires are being met. So we have preferences for all sorts of things. Preferences for pets, jobs, cheese, all sorts of preferences. And the more we have met, the happier we are. So that's the kind of the local version, the more that we perceive to be met. Or we could look at preference satisfaction on the global version, where this is a judgment that your life overall is going well. And on some accounts, you might formulate that judgment, again, as I suggested earlier, by sort of ranking the important things in your life, which preferences to you matter most. And as long as those are perceived to you to be satisfied, then you're happy. And so you see why on all of the, in all of the cases, that kind of view would judge everyone as happy. Because in all of our cases, well, we have a question mark for Joe, because we don't know what his judgment would be. But in all of those cases, these people seem to think their life is going very well.
And then when you get to below that line, right, where you start to look at things as happiness as well-being, right, we also have broken it up there a little bit. So subjective well-being really just sort of reflects, right, the two mental state accounts with one additional sort of add-on, right, namely that it's not enough that you just perceive your desires to be met, they also actually have to be met. And then that's what it is for your life to actually be going well for you. So you see then that the subjective well-being account sort of mirrors, right, the positive affect account with one exception, right? Now Hugh isn't happy because he's sort of radically deceived about whether or not his life is actually going. But in Jill's case and in Judah's case, it does seem, right, that their subjective preferences are in fact actually being satisfied, right? Then if you look at the idealized account, this is an account where maybe we say, well, look, it's not enough just that your subjective preferences are actually being met. I mean, maybe you need to choose those preferences from a position of information or autonomy, right? So maybe we put some restrictions on the sorts of values that are actually going to be important to your happiness. And if we do that, then it turns out that only one person of those three is actually happy, and that's Judah, presumably because he's actually deliberated and thought carefully about what his values are and acted accordingly. On the other hand, right, we also have what are known as perfectionist accounts, and on these perfectionist accounts of happiness, what it means to be happy is that you've perfected your nature, whatever that is, whatever that turns out being, right? And so on the perfectionist accounts of happiness, every single one of our case studies fails to be happy, right? Hugh fails to be happy because his life, right, is one that's of deception, right? Jill fails to be happy because she lacks an important feature of a good life, autonomy, right? Judah fails to be happy because he lacks an important feature of the good life, moral virtue. And last but not least, Joe Paterno ends in shame and embarrassment, so he too fails to secure the excellent human life for this perfectionist account.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions?